Hello, everyone. Happy New Year. I hope this year is off to a great start for you. Welcome to 2024. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joshua Crawford. I'm a medical educator, owner of a company called Level Up Medic. I have a medical background and also a history in aviation, but that's actually not what I'm here to talk about today. In fact, I want to talk about you. So as we've kicked off this year, I started just thinking about my life and how did I get to this point? I'm doing a video about all the people that God placed in my life who were specific links along the chain that would open up the next door. Okay, so here's what I want you to do. I want you to watch the entire video. I will talk about many of you. I want you to do something else for me. There's something really special at the end. I think you're going to like it. But I want you to share this with as many people as possible. Let's see how much joy we can spread. I also want you to do one other thing. As I'm going through this, there again, I want you to think about your own story. And one other thing I do want you to do is I want you to comment. Tell me how this video relates to you. Tell me how you see yourself in this story. So I was in church one day and my pastor, Dr. Bill Purvis from Cascade Hills Church, he started telling a story about this little boy who was walking along one day, walking in the park, and he came to a fence post. And sitting atop the fence post was this turtle. And the boy thought, that's strange. The boy said to himself, I don't know how this turtle got here, but I know he didn't get here by himself. Well, my story and your story is probably very similar to that little turtle. Perhaps you haven't thought about it, or maybe you know the answer to how did you get here? But I'm willing to bet that you didn't get where you are by yourself. So I want to take a moment to celebrate all the heroes who God used along my journey. So let's go. I don't know how long this video will be. Honestly, it was very emotional for me to think about it and just relive all of the moments. That's why it's taken me so long. Honestly, I've been working on this for weeks. It took a long time to find all of the pictures and so forth. But I want to just share with you the people who God used in my life. But I also want it to be a reminder to you that be very, very careful about how you treat the people who come into your life. You never know why they're there. But I want you to think about the importance of being kind, treating everyone with respect, showing everyone an extra dose of love, patience, kindness, and joy, being willing to listen to them, being willing to encourage them, because you never know the difference that you'll make in their life. As I started thinking about my life and how it's had ups and downs, and there have been challenges, there have been successes, there were times when I didn't know how things were going to work out. But here's one thing that I've learned over the years, that even when it looks like it's not working, everything is working for your good. Now, sometimes things are working for you, and those are the moments we love. But there are other times where it's working on you. But either way, it's working. So, as I'm going through the people, to be honest, I can't include everybody only because this video would be like 3 days, but I wanted to specifically highlight who did God use at different moments that would be the key to open the next door. Now, some of your names may have changed due to life circumstances. Maybe you got married, maybe you got divorced, or you had some other life-altering event. I apologize if I get the name incorrect. It's just this is what I remember based on when you were in my life or the last time we connected. But for instance, some of you I haven't talked to in many years. So I want to first start in the very beginning, literally. It starts with my own mom, Mama Linda. Now I'm a little biased, but I feel like I have probably the greatest mom on earth. My mom has been there for me since literally the very beginning. She's been so supportive, so loving, so kind, so encouraging. My mom has been my rock. I'm so grateful to you, Mom, for just showing me unconditional love and support, for encouraging me to go for it and push for my dreams. Thank you for believing in me. Thank you for being by my side through the ups and the downs. And Mom, I just love you more than you know. And thank you for all that you've done. Now, it wasn't just my mom. Obviously, I have a whole family. And so there have been, aunts and uncles and cousins and all of that. But specifically, I want to recognize my dad and my sisters who were there in the house with me, also there a part of the journey, and there kind of every step along the way. So Dad, thank you. Thank you for being there. Jessica, Jasmine, I'm so proud of both of you. I love you more than you know. And I just thank you for all of your encouragement along the way. I want to go back to those early days. Now, I don't have a whole lot of memory. I did happen to find one picture of me when I was a little kid. I think I'm probably about the same. But check out this picture from when I was a little boy. Now, I don't have a whole lot of memory, only because when I was very, very young, I ended up having a concussion. When I was about 5 years old, I was at my cousin's one day, and I was jumping on a bed, and they probably said something like, "Hey, stop jumping on the bed before you hurt your head." Well, that's actually what happened. I went up and down several times. On the last time, I fell, and the metal railing that goes underneath the mattress ended up striking my head, and I blacked out. I don't really remember anything after then. What I do recall is waking up in the hospital. Now, my mom used to tell me about this story a lot over the years. I mean, she's told me so many times. And she would say, "Oh, son, I remember they called me and I showed up at the hospital. The paramedics transported you and you were in a straitjacket." And I'm like, what is a straitjacket? I would later find out that she was talking about the pediatric immobilization device. I think I have a picture of that. Yeah. So she was talking about this pediatric immobilization device where they strapped me down, put a cervical collar around my neck. Anyway, I woke up in the emergency room. Now, all I remember is seeing the bright lights in the hospital and just it being a really terrifying place. But obviously it all worked out. The only thing is I have no memory prior to then. So I have no memory prior to about the age of 5, but I have like super memory after then. So I want to pick up the story from there. So I'm about 5 years old. I'm at this school, this elementary school in kindergarten. Well, I was a very energetic kid and probably a little rambunctious. I had this principal named Mr. Chuck Enfinger. Now, I don't have a picture of Mr. Enfinger. I just wasn't able to find one. But I remember Mr. Enfinger, like I said, his name was Chuck Enfinger. Mr. Enfinger did recognize something in me, though. And fortunately, he decided that I wasn't the best fit for that school. He felt like I needed to be challenged more. So he ended up calling a friend of his, a principal at another school. Her name was Miss Springer, Miss Maggie Springer. Here's a picture of Miss Springer. She was my first and second grade principal. They were starting a magnet school at this other elementary school, and they felt like I'd be a better fit there. So I started at this next school, and Miss Springer, she kind of took an interest in me. I remember she gave me, so I'm like first grade, she gave me this African violet plant. And I remember her pulling me in the hallway one day, or this happened several times, but she would pull me in the hallway and work with me after school. She took an interest in me. So she gave me this plant and she started teaching me. Now I'm like 6 years old. She starts teaching me about photosynthesis of all things. But I remember there was one thing that Miss Springer said to me. She said, "Son, I want you to take care of this plant. Who knows, you may be a scientist or a doctor one day." Now I'm 6 years old. This would start the process of me developing an interest in science. I recently found out that Miss Springer went on and transitioned, and she's now in heaven. I believe she passed away last year in 2023 or 2022 or sometime recently. But Miss Springer, I just want to tell you, thank you so much. Thank you for believing in me. When I was that 6-year-old kid, thank you for taking an interest in me. Thank you for encouraging me. Thank you for seeing something in me at such an early age. I remember those words because those words would carry me through the rest of my life. That who knows, young man, maybe you could be a scientist or a doctor one day. So Miss Springer, thank you so much. Well, I kept going and I went through, guys, I'm going to do the best I can, but this is tough. So I fast forward, I'm now in about third grade. I end up going to another school. I believe we moved, ended up in a different area, and so I ended up being zoned for a different school. So now I'm like third grade, and I noticed my classmates, I would see classmates coming in sometimes and then they'd leave. Like on Tuesdays and Thursdays, they'd be there and then they'd be gone for hours, but they'd come back all happy, and I'm like, hey, I don't know what they're doing, but they seem to be way more happy than us. The rest of us are just sitting there in class. Our drill sergeant, our teacher is teaching us, and I don't know, it just wasn't as much fun. I noticed these other kids were having a lot more fun than I seemed to be having, and a lot of my other classmates. Well, I found out the reason they were leaving on Tuesdays and Thursdays is they were going to this gifted program called Quest. So I said, hey, wait a minute. All I know is they're having a lot more fun. So I found out the reason they were going away is they were the quote-unquote gifted kids. And I'm like, I need to check into that. So I just remember I wanted whatever they had. Well, I found out they had to be tested into this program. So I ended up talking to our guidance counselor, and they decided they were going to test me. So I had to come to school on a Saturday, and anyway, I later found out they were doing an IQ test. Fortunately for me, I was able to get into this gifted program, and so I spent 4th through 6th grade in this program called Quest. I have a picture of when I was in traffic patrol in 4th grade. So this is me as a 4th grader. I'm on the traffic patrol. I'm already a sergeant. I made sergeant that year, and then I went on, and the next year I believe I was a lieutenant. I guess this is where my whole journey in public safety started. But fast forward, and the reason I got in traffic patrol is I had the option of doing like supply cart or traffic patrol. I was like, who wants to just walk around asking people, do they want to buy some pencils and crayons? Traffic patrol seemed to be way more fun. In fact, that's where I had my very first girlfriend. I never forgot. In fact, I had 2 girlfriends. Don't tell anybody. I had 2 girlfriends at the same time, Chandler Gaines and Jessica Winston. And I knew I was in love because Chandler, she would share her sausage biscuit with me. And then she would sometimes go ahead. Now, she was my superior. So when I was a sergeant, she was my lieutenant. And when I was a lieutenant, she was my captain. But she was also my girlfriend. So we would share a sausage biscuit, and she did something I thought was really strange. She would take the jelly and put it on the top of the biscuit. Well, I saw her do it, and I started doing that. But then she would sometimes go ahead in the breakfast line, and she would get some hot chocolate for me. So she would get one for me and one for her. Yeah, I knew I was in love. But anyway, so fast forward, I end up in this program called Quest, like I said, and I have this teacher named Miss Strong. Now, I wasn't able to get a picture of her, but Miss Julie Carr Strong. Miss Strong took such an interest in me. She just made learning fun. So by the time I'm in 4th grade, I'm in this program. I get to go out on Tuesdays and Thursdays, but we're doing things like going on nature hikes and wading in the water, collecting tadpoles, and we're starting to play chess, and we're doing things like Scholars Bowl and just having way more fun. But Miss Strong sparked another interest in me. I I remember one time we were going to a state park, Lake Guntersville State Park, and she wanted us to see the bald eagles. Well, this was the very first time that I would ever go camping in my life, but that sparked something in me. All I knew is I was having a whole lot of fun. I'll get to that in just a moment. But around this same time, I was going to see my great-grandfather one year. I'm about 10 years old, and my great-grandfather, come to find out, he was what is now a respiratory therapist, but he was like a pulmonary specialist in World War II. Well, so I'm at his house one day, and I find this stethoscope. Now, it's a really old-fashioned stethoscope from World War II. So I inquired about it, and he gave it to me. In fact, he gave me 2 of them. So my great-grandfather, Mancy Crawford, gave me my very first stethoscope at age 10 years old. This would solidify my interest in becoming a doctor. And from that moment, I knew for sure that being a doctor is what I wanted to do with my life. My great-grandfather passed when I was much younger, but I'm just so grateful for him, and he was a man that didn't say much, but I just loved being in his presence. I always called him Granddad. I never knew my biological grandfather, so this was my granddad. But Granddad, I just appreciate you. Thank you so much. Thank you for just being there for us. Thank you for being our rock. We love you more than you know. So fast forward, one day I come home, and one of my friends from down the street, he had gotten in Boy Scouts. He had been going to the troop meetings about 3 weeks. So he comes, it's on a Tuesday, and he says, "Hey, Joshua, we have a Boy Scout meeting tonight. Would you like to come?" So I asked my parents, and they said, "Okay, sure." Well, so I ended up going to Boy Scout meetings. And while I'm there, well, long story short, so the guy, his name was Terrence. Terrence ended up dropping out of Boy Scouts like the next week. So I get to Boy Scouts, and I meet this guy named Mr. Wolfe, my Scoutmaster. And Mr. Wolfe, he was this engineer that kind of took an interest in me. Mr. Wolfe was just so kind to me. He taught me so many life lessons. I spent years with him. In fact, I spent about 7 years with Mr. Wolfe, doing so many things in Scouts. Well, anyway, I get to Boy Scouts. 2 weeks later, after I get there, Mr. Wolfe says, "Hey, we are going on outing to summer camp." Summer camp is like a week, the next week, or 2 weeks later, but most of the boys had already registered for summer camp at that point. So Mr. Wolfe said, "Hey, I don't know what classes we're going to be able to get you in. I don't know what merit badges we're going to be able to do since it starts in like 2 weeks. But I'm going to call the council office and we'll see what we can do." Would you know that the very first merit badge I ended up doing was first aid merit badge? So I ended up going in first aid merit badge. I remember I'm 11 years old at this point. We're working on the CPR mannequin, and I remember, now this was the old-fashioned little Annie, so the big, monstrous kind of mannequin. I just remember that thing looked really creepy, but I was hooked. It was something about that whole first aid experience that fascinated me. Fast forward, year after year, I would go to summer camp. We'd go on outings every single month. We'd do things like caving and spelunking. We'd go backpacking and hiking and whitewater rafting and just so much. Well, one day, on one of the outings, I'm talking to my assistant scoutmaster. So I had this assistant scoutmaster named Mr. Griffin. I had Mr. Wolfe and Mr. Griffin the entire time. Well, one day on one of the outings, I'm talking to Mr. Griffin at a camp out. So in Boy Scouts, it's boy-led, and Mr. Wolfe and Mr. Griffin, they were over in their section. They always had way better food than we had as the boys. They would have things like steak and shrimp or filet mignon, and we're over eating sloppy Joe. So I just kind of moseyed over to Mr. Wolfe and Mr. Griffin's area of the campground, and I started talking to Mr. Griffin. Well, come to find out, he was a pilot. So I'm talking to Mr. Griffin, and I'm like, hey, Mr. Griffin, I want to know more about this flight stuff. So Mr. Griffin says, oh, well, that's no problem. I actually teach a merit badge called the Aviation Merit Badge. So if you will take the merit badge, I can tell you so much about aviation. So year after year, I would hear Mr. Griffin talk about stories of flying, and he loved talking about it. In fact, this plane, let's go back to that. Mr. Griffin's, well, not this plane. At the time, he had built another plane, and it only had one seat. So he said that he couldn't take me in his plane, but he had a friend that could maybe take me up one day. But long story short, year after year, Mr. Wolfe and Mr. Griffin would work with me. They would teach me so much. These guys, both of them, Mr. Wolfe and Mr. Griffin, let's go back to that. Mr. Wolfe, my Scoutmaster. Mr. Griffin, my Assistant Scoutmaster. I want to thank both of you. Thank you for just taking me in, accepting me as like a member of your own family. Thank you for the difference that you made in my life. We spent so many years together. You taught me so much, both of you. You were so kind to me. You took such interest in me. You were so patient with me. You were so loving. You taught me how to be a better dad. You taught me how to be a great husband eventually. Thank you for the difference that you made in my life. As I was saying, Mr. Griffin, one day, I was asking him about the whole flying thing, and he told me that he had a friend that could take me on a flight. So he introduced me to his friend, Mr. Stan 2, and Mr. 2 took me on my very first flight. So I'm terrified. I'm 14 years old. Mr. 2's plane, in fact, this is the very plane. This yellow plane is the very plane that I went in, my very first time being in a plane ever, my very first flight in life. I had never been on a commercial plane at this point, and Mr. 2 took me up. Now, it was a terrifying experience. I remember I literally thought we went upside down. Come to find out, it was just I wasn't really used to some of the G-forces that we'd experienced. But he flew us over our neighborhood, and from that moment, I was hooked. So remember this story because it's going to come back up in just a moment. So fast forward, I'm now about 15 years old, and I end up in high school. I have this teacher named Miss Dellner. I don't have a picture of her, but Miss Judy Dellner. Miss Dellner took an interest in me in high school, and I'm just so grateful. Miss Dellner, I want to tell you thank you so much. I wish I could get back in touch with you. I don't really know what happened, but she took such interest in me. She taught me so much. There's this one particular day, Miss Dellner came to me and said, hey, I have an opportunity for 3 students to go to the hospital and shadow in the emergency room. Would you like to be one of those 3 people? And I'm like, of course I want to go. What do I need to do? So she tells us we have to get this waiver signed. We end up going to the emergency room, and I start shadowing in the ER. This one particular day, my very first day there, I meet this doctor named Dr. Shaw. He comes to me and says, hey, I have this patient with stridor. Now, stridor is a respiratory sound that's produced. It's an inspiratory, it's where the airway is starting to close. There's pressure kind of pushing on the airway from the outside, and so you're having trouble breathing in, and it produces this kind of sound called stridor. He says, I have a patient with stridor. I'm about to go intubate this patient. Would you like to come? So I said, sure. I end up going over. The doctor starts to intubate the patient, so he's going to drop a tube down their throat, put them on a ventilator, and assist them with their breathing. Well, right after we finished that case, the house supervisor comes to me. Her name was Miss Susan. She was one of those old school nurses, you know, the kind that wore that white hat. And Miss Susan came to me. There was a guy named Andy Mills that was with me that day. She came to Andy and I and said, hey, we have a patient that just expired, a patient that just passed away. I need you, young man, to take her to the morgue. I'm like, the morgue. She said, I need you to put a tag on her toe. You're going to transfer her from the bed to this gurney. It was like a linen thing that had this flat top across, so that as we were rolling the body down the hallway, people wouldn't know there was a body inside of this linen cart thing. I just remember that was kind of creepy to me, but it was the house supervisor. She said I had to do it, and I didn't really have a choice. So I said, okay, if I want to come back here, I probably need to do what she says. So I think I have a picture of that. Yeah, this is what they wore, that old school kind of that old school nursing uniform. Well, anyway, we returned from the morgue, and I meet these guys in the emergency room. Come to find out, they were paramedics. So I asked one of them, hey, what do you guys do? And they're like, oh, we're paramedics. He said, hey, you should come ride with us on the ambulance. I'm like, for real? I can do that? He said, yeah, all you have to do is call the station in the morning. Now, I'm in high school. Remember, I'm 15 years old. He says, call the station in the morning. All you have to do is fill out this little waiver, and you'll get to ride with us. So I call, sure enough, the next day I call the station, and they agreed for me to ride on the ambulance. And I'm riding with this company called Rural Metro Ambulance Service. Come to find out, they would go out of business about a month later. So I rode with them for that first month. About a month later, they go out of business. Well, I remembered that a few weeks prior, there was this guy named Mr. Kelly Gordon who had come to my Boy Scout troop, and he was talking about fire safety. He was the fire marshal, I believe, from the fire department. He said, hey, or I reached out to him and said, hey, I used to ride with a Rural Metro Ambulance Service. They went out of business. Is there a way that I could ride with you guys? What I noticed is, this was Montgomery, Alabama, the Montgomery Fire Department. I noticed that the fire department was getting the calls first, and then it would roll over to the ambulance service. But the fire medics were the first ones on scene. So I said, hey, they're seeing all the action. I'd like to maybe ride with them. So he said, okay, you have to call downtown to the chief's office. I remember it was a unit called Carr 25. It was the deputy EMS chief. I would literally have to call every single day. So the plan was for me to ride for about 2 weeks with the rescue truck. He arranged for me to ride at fire station number 6 in Montgomery, Alabama on a unit called Rescue 90. So I show up on Rescue 90 this one particular day, and I meet this gentleman named, at the time he was Sergeant O'Connor. He would go on and become Captain O'Connor. I remember his partner's name was Mr. Willie Smith. They were both fire medics. But Sergeant O'Connor, from the very first day I got there, he welcomed me with open arms. He took such interest in me. I remember he used to call me Doogie for Doogie Howser. I didn't know. I was like, Doogie, what a crazy name. Then he told me about this show called Doogie Howser, MD. I was a 15-year-old kid, wanted to be a doctor. He said that reminded him of Doogie. Well, Captain O'Connor took such an interest in me. He taught me so much. I remember he would tell me, he said, all right, Doogie, I need you to make yourself useful. So he taught me how to get vital signs, and he taught me how to spike the IV bag. So I would, put the spike into the bag, prime the tubing, flush the line, so that once he started the IV tubing was ready. Well, Captain O'Connor, I love this man so much. I recently had an opportunity to, in fact, just the week of Christmas, I ended up flying back to the South. I'm in Illinois now, but I went back and I got to connect with him. In fact, my children were with me. We got to actually have coffee with Captain O'Connor. But I remember this one particular day, we go on a call and a lady's in labor. I'm 16 at this point. A lady's in labor. At that time, I was a really skinny guy, and so I was probably the smallest person. So how the lady was positioned, he said, all right, come here. I need you to go over here. I'm going to hand everything. The baby's coming now. You're going to deliver it. Immediately, I was terrified. I'm like, what do you mean I'm going to deliver it? All I know is I didn't know what I was doing. I just trusted him. He said, okay, I'm going to tell you everything to do. So he told me where to place the first clamp. Then he told me where to place the next clamp. So first I checked for a pulse. There was no pulse in the umbilical cord. I placed the first clamp, placed the second clamp. He said, all right, Doogie, I want you to cut between the clamps. There again, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm just following him. I'm just so focused at this point because I'm also terrified. But I'm kind of trapped, and the baby's coming, and I don't have time. They don't have time to move the patient and all of that. So long story short, the delivery was a success. Here it is. I'm a 16-year-old kid, and now I just assisted in delivering a baby. We were talking about this recently when we had coffee together. He said, well, I guess everything worked well because neither one of us got in trouble. But there was another time where I would see my first decapitation, a motorcycle accident. And I just remember being a 16-year-old kid, and Captain O'Connor told me to take the head that was still inside of the helmet and put it in a biohazard bag. And I just remember how odd that story was, but I just trusted him. But see, the thing is, Captain O'Connor got me involved in everything. I want to go back to him for just a moment. Captain O'Connor, thank you for modeling such grace. You treated everybody with respect. When I was that third rider, you got me involved. You didn't just make me sit over in the corner. You taught me every chance you got. When I would ask you lots of questions, and I was very curious, I would ask you all these questions and you would just answer them. You never dismiss it. If you didn't know the answer, you'd say, hey, I don't know, but let's find out together. Captain O'Connor, thank you so much for just loving me. Thank you for modeling such excellence. I didn't tell you until recently, but I always wanted to be just like you. Wow. Captain O'Connor, thank you for being one of my earliest teachers. I owe so much of my success in medicine and EMS to those moments that I got to spend with you, those 2 years when we got to spend together. Captain O'Connor, I hope I've made you proud. So I would go on and finish high school and, get my Eagle Scout, finish high school. Well, one day I got invited to a business meeting, and there was this couple I met at this business presentation, a couple by the name of Carl and Carol Tucker. Carl and Carol Tucker kind of took me under their wing early on, so I'm about 18 years old at this point, and they started teaching me things about business and entrepreneurship and capitalism and free enterprise. We would work together every single week, year after year, for several years. They just were some of my earliest business mentors. I owe so much of what I've learned to Carl and Carol for all that you taught me. Thank you for being so patient with me. Thank you for being so loving, so supportive. Thank you, Carl and Carol, for all that you've done for me. So, and guys, I do apologize that the video may be going a little long, but I think it's important that I not rush through this. So I went from being mentored by Carl and Carol, and then next thing I know, I go from being a kid to eventually having kids. I'd meet this lady, and she would basically threaten me and beg me to marry her. No, I wish I could say that was the story, but I ended up meeting a young lady, and we would get married, have our first child, and well, actually we had our first child and then got married. So this was my son Joshua. There it is. First it was just 2 of us, and then 3 of us. Then our family would continue to grow, and then there would be one more. If you'll notice this picture in the lower right corner, that's my daughter. Every time I look at this picture, it just makes me smile. My daughter would always say this thing about she was my favorite child, and I said, Cameron, I don't have a favorite. I love both of you. I just have to, I have to love you both. I love you just in different ways. But I remember when she was born, everybody in the family, they said, oh, this girl's going to have you wrapped around her finger. And I'm like, yeah, not me. Nobody's going to have me wrapped around anybody's finger. But, I'll never admit if it happened or not. But so our family continued to grow. We went from the 3 of us to 4 of us. Then there was a dog. We ended up with our dog, Hercules. Herky passed away this past year after spending about 11 and a half years with the family. Herky, we miss you so, so much. But the kids would grow up and get older. Here's a picture of both of the kids as they've gotten older. And now my son is turning 20. Can you believe it? And my daughter's about to graduate high school. But I would continue on and have to, now with my family growing, I'd have to take on additional responsibility. So I found myself in a job where I'm now working at the Mercedes dealership. So I start selling cars at Mercedes. Well, one particular day, I remember being on crutches. I had injured my knee. I'm an immobilizer. I'm on crutches. I'm crutching around the car lot. And I meet this gentleman named Dr. Bob Wright. Dr. Wright comes up to me. Come to find out, he was an optometrist as well as a philanthropist. And he came up to me and said, young man, you're just the kind of guy we need. I found out that he was on the board of directors at a company known as Aflac, an insurance company. And he said, hey, you don't really belong here. You don't belong in this car business. You're just the kind of guy we need in our corporate environment at Aflac. So through that situation, Dr. Wright and I went to lunch that particular day. This was on a Tuesday. He said, hey, I have a friend who happens to be the vice president of HR. I'm going to reach out to her. We could probably get you on. So he set up an interview with me. Now, remember, I'm on crutches, so I can't really get around well. Well, during the interview, they decide to cater lunch for me. So sure enough, my interview, they cater lunch for me. Well, I got hired, and so I ended up starting my career as an auditor at Aflac. I had been there for a few years, and I just was feeling like it wasn't really me. I'm an auditor at this point. I'm dressing up in a shirt and tie every day. I liked that part, but I didn't like just sitting there in a cubicle silent all day long for hours. I'm like, this is not my life. This is not what I want. And I remember just dreaming about, gosh, there has to be something more. I remember I always wanted to be a doctor. I'm like, hey, there's got to be something more. But at this point, I had kind of paused school and I needed to get back into college. Well, one particular night, I remember it was a Monday night, I'm watching TBN on TV. There's a minister by the name of Bishop T.D. Jakes, and he had just written this book about reposition yourself. And I just remember one line from that broadcast. He said, you can't wait for anybody else to take action, or you can't wait for anybody else to do anything for you. You got to take action. He said, you can't wait for anybody else to do anything for you. You got to take action. And for some reason, that just spoke to me. So the very next day, that was on a Monday night, I literally went into my closet and I just started praying, God, I just need you to open up a door for me. So the next morning on Tuesday, I thought about this lady who was one of the vice presidents. And I sent an email to her secretary. The secretary said, okay, guess what? Miss Gladys has agreed to meet with you. So I would meet this lady named Miss Gladys. Miss Gladys, in our meeting, so we met on a Friday, and she asked me one question. She said, young man, why haven't you finished school? I said, well, honestly, Miss Gladys, I don't have the money. She said, well, that's not a problem anymore. I'm like, what do you mean that's not a problem? When I came in here today, that was a problem. Miss Gladys said, I happen to be on the scholarship committee, and I'm the chairman of the committee. That's no longer a problem. Would you know, she told me to, she said, okay, this is on a Friday. She said, I want you to go and apply to school today. And we had planned to go out of town for the weekend. So I said, hey, as soon as I get off work, I've got to go. We've already booked a trip and we're heading out of town. But if you don't mind, when I come back on Monday, I will apply then. Is that okay? And she said, well, you've waited this long. What's a few more days? So sure enough, I applied and ended up getting a scholarship. I got accepted and ended up getting a scholarship to go to college. Miss Gladys, thank you for making such a difference in my life. I am so grateful for you just opening that door, and I'm grateful to you, Dr. Wright. Thank you both. So fast forward, I end up starting college. I'm at this church, and I decided I wanted to be a part of the EMS ministry at the church. There's a lady named Miss Sansbury, who is the director of our EMS ministry at Faith Worship Center. She's a registered nurse, and she was, at the time, I believe she was like the charge nurse, OR circulator or something. But in that conversation, or more specifically through that relationship with her, one day when I'm having a conversation with Miss Sansbury, she says, hey, there's a guy that I want you to meet. His name is Dr. Alexander. He's an orthopedic surgeon. I think he'd be a great person for you to talk to. So Miss Sansbury arranged for me to meet, or she told me about this guy named Dr. Alexander, Dr. Emory Alexander. She said, hey, Dr. Alexander is going to be at the mall on Saturday. He's going to be doing a talk. I think you need to hook up with him. So I go to the mall. Now, she described him as this guy with this thick mustache. But at the time, I don't know what he looks like. So I literally go up to every single guy that's a tall guy with a thick mustache. And I'm like, hey, are you Dr. Alexander? They said, no, but he's coming. Go to the next guy. Are you Dr. Alexander? No, but he's coming. I think I did this for 3 or 4 guys. Finally, they said, that's him. That's Dr. Alexander. He was doing a talk at the mall. They were doing a men's health thing with the fraternity, and he was doing a talk on low back pain. I remember him coming off the stage, and I walked up to him. Dr. Alexander, my name is Joshua Crawford. I was referred to you by a lady named Miss Sansbury. He said, oh yeah, I know her, over at the OR at the hospital. I said, yes. Miss Sansbury told me to get in touch with you. She said, you'd be a great person to mentor me. He said, okay, well, I don't really have time to talk right now, but because this is a Saturday, he had other obligations. So he said, I'm about to leave, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to call my office on Monday morning, talk to Brenda. She's my office manager. And Miss Brenda will get you on my calendar, and you can come and talk to me in my office. So sure enough, I went there on that Saturday. No, I'm sorry, I went there called on that Monday, spoke to Miss Brenda, and said, hey, I met Dr. Alexander this weekend. I'd like to get on his calendar and set up a time to come see him in his office. She said, okay. So I go to his office, and I'm looking around, and I see all this stuff about the FDA. And I'm like, hey, what's all this on the wall? He said, oh, I invented a spinal system. I have a plating system. This is my invention. It's sold all around the world. It's used in orthopedic cases all around the world. I'm a fellowship-trained hand, general ortho, and spine surgeon. Come to find out, I would find out that he was one of, I think, one of about 20 physicians that had completed 3 fellowships. Just a brilliant guy. But Dr. Alexander took me under his wing. I spent a couple years with him, hundreds of surgeries. Dr. Alexander was just so kind. Dr. Alexander was just so patient, so loving. I would see so many patients, and I would see how he would talk to their families. I would see how he would talk to the staff. He would stop whatever he was doing and talk to the housekeepers, talk to the lab techs. He would talk to everybody. One day we're riding in his Corvette, and he stops in the middle of the street because he sees somebody he knows. And I'm like, Dr. Alexander, what are you doing? You're going to get us killed. You can't just stop in the middle of the street. But he was such a loving guy. And Dr. Alexander, you taught me so much. Thank you for just modeling, again, such love, such patience, such kindness. You taught me to treat everybody with respect. Thank you for all that you taught me. Thank you for taking me under your wing. Thank you for mentoring me through those years. I love you so much. I love you more than you know. Thank you, Dr. Alexander. So one particular day, I'm with Dr. Alexander. We go to do a consult, an ortho consult at one of the other hospitals. So we end up in the emergency department, and he's talking to the doctor. I'm talking to this paramedic I just see standing there. I'm bored at that point. I'm just kind of waiting on him to finish what he's doing. Well, I meet this young lady named Rachel. Her name is Rachel Madumba. She was a paramedic at the time. Come to find out, we would end up later working together. But during that conversation with Rachel, she said, "Hey, have you considered EMS?" At the time, I was working at AFLAC, and she said, "Hey, have you considered maybe a career in EMS? You wanted to be a doctor. This could be a great step in the right direction." I said, "Well, I hadn't really considered it, but okay, what's that all about?" So she starts telling me about being a paramedic, and she says, "Hey, you should really look into it." Well, I didn't think anything of it. I just went on about my day, followed Dr. Alexander around. We went on, did some more cases. About a week later, I'm thinking one day, and I'm like, "Hey, you know what? I should check into that." I remember what Rachel said to me, and I said, "Hey, you know what? I really need to maybe give that a second thought." So, and Rachel, by the way, thank you so much for just taking time with me that day. You didn't have to stop. You didn't have to take any time with me at all, but you did, and I really appreciate it. One particular day, I decided, hey, you know what? I remember what that paramedic said. I decided to go over to an ambulance station, and I went to this place called Mid-Georgia Ambulance. I think the name later changed to Community Ambulance. I go to this ambulance station, and I meet this young lady. She was the paramedic supervisor at the time. Her name was Shalonda. Wright. She came out. It's late one night. It's about 9 p.m. The units are on calls, so she comes out and starts talking to me. And so I start asking her questions about, hey, what's it like as a paramedic? And I don't really know much about it other than when I was in high school, I used to ride with some fire medics. So I have some experience with it, but I just don't know enough. But what's it like? And so she starts telling me. And so she says, hey, you should consider EMT school. Okay, well, tell me more about that. She says, oh, I remember inside we have a flyer on the bulletin board. But I remember seeing a flyer, but I think the class has already started. So at this point, this is December of that year. This is 2008, I believe. And she goes and gets the flyer and says, hey, there is a class that started, but it started months ago in Noonan, Georgia. She said, take down the information because maybe you can get into the next class. Okay, so she said, you can get into the next class. And I'm like, I don't know about that. I remember getting the information, writing it down, and there was an instructor and his number listed. So I ended up calling him, and I'll tell you about that in just a second. But Shalonda, thank you so much. Shalonda, thank you for taking time with me that day. Thank you for just giving a listening ear to a total stranger. That conversation would spark so much in my life, and I appreciate you so much. So I took down the number, as I said. I called the instructor. I talked to this guy named Jeff. And it's over the Christmas break. There's this guy named Jeff Denny, and he says his class is already going on. I can't even believe I did this. He said, hey, my class started several months ago. We're going to start back the first Monday in January after the Christmas break. I said, well, is there any way I can get in the class? And he said, class started months ago. You've already missed several months of class. I said, well, sir, I've been a CPR instructor for years. I believe I can do it. He must have thought I was nuts. Would you know, Guys, it's just amazing how God just aligns circumstances and events and people, that you don't always have to have everything figured out. You just have to trust the process, that you have to trust that God would not leave you. He would not forsake you. Sure enough, he said, young man, I don't even know why I'm doing this. This is kind of crazy, but we're starting back the first Monday in January. What I want you to do is I want you to show up a couple hours ahead of time. I'm going to give you an exam over everything that they've tested on so far. I'm like, okay, so do I have any books? He's like, you'll get your books that same day. And I said, well, what do I study from? He's like, you want to do this. So I had no study materials at all. I just figured, hey, you know what? I think I can do it. I show up 2 hours early on that Monday. He gives me a test. Because the thing was, if you pass the test, I'll let you in the class. Would you know that I showed up the 2 hours early, took the test, and I passed it? But Jeff took a chance with me. Jeff taught me so much. I remember that first day, so after I finished taking the test, I went back and sat in my car in the parking lot and waiting for everybody to show up and waiting for class to start at 9 o'clock. I'm noticing all these guys, and this is a place called Newnan, Georgia. I swear it looks like a place like out of Mayberry from the Andy Griffith Show. There's nobody that looks like me. I'm the only person of color. I see guy after guy walk in. Everybody's in like EMS uniforms. I see everybody has a pocket knife in their pocket. Some guys have like a can of chewing tobacco in their mouth, in their, I'm like, wait a minute, I'm so out of place here. But I remember sitting on the front row, the very first row, first seat, closest to him. That's the only seat that was available, so that's where I ended up sitting. They welcomed me with such open arms. I felt so at home. They invited me to participate with a lot of the other guys and do other outings. I remember going to a pool party with them, and we just had such a great time. But Jeff took a chance with me. Jeff taught me so much. He was so patient. I imagine, where would my life be today if Jeff Denny and his wonderful wife, Miss April, if they had not given me that opportunity? Jeff, I want to tell you so much, just how much I appreciate you. Jeff, you changed my life. You opened so many doors for me. Now, Jeff would tell me how he's told me many times over the years, he said, Joshua, you were the only person to have ever scored a 100 on my final. So remember, I was the only person of color. I came in after everybody else, and I ended up being the number one student in the class. Now, I think the actual story is I had like a 94, but on the final, but I challenged him on a few questions and told him why my answer was right. So, I don't know if he thought I was crazy or what, but Jeff, after evaluating it, he said, hey, you've made your case. I'm going to give you those points back. And then that's what boosted me up to 100. So, Jeff, thank you so much. Miss April, I appreciate you guys more than you know. So, as the curriculum advances, it's now time for me to do ride-alongs, but Newnan, Georgia was about an hour away, and so I wanted to be able to get something closer to home in Columbus, Georgia. So Jeff said, okay, well, we don't have any contracts in that area, so you'll have to arrange it for yourself. And I said, okay, well, I'll do it. So I ended up, remember how when I was 15, 16, 17 years old, I was riding at Station 6 with Captain O'Connor. Would you know that years later, I would end up in Georgia and I would go to Station 6. I'd go to Station 6, and this one particular day, I show up because I'm just trying to get someplace to be able to do my ride-alongs on the ambulance. I show up, and I meet this guy that comes out. At the time, I believe he was I think he was about to be promoted to sergeant, but his name was Fred Mosley. He would later go on and become Captain Fred Mosley. But I strike up a conversation with Fred that day, and I'm like, hey, sir, I'm an EMT student. I need to do some ride-alongs with the paramedic. He says, I'm not a paramedic right now, but we do have a paramedic here. So he talked to me for a moment, and he said, hey, let me go get our paramedic who's on the ambulance today, on Medic 6. So Fred took his time with me, and Fred, I appreciate you so much. Fred would go on and become one of my greatest mentors. He would become just not only a mentor, but just a very trusted friend. Fred would teach me how to be just a loving father and patient husband. He would teach me so much about just having great morals and values. And Fred, I appreciate you so much for all the conversations that we've had over the years. Thank you for guiding me. Thank you for mentoring me. I would go on and become a paramedic, and in terms of medically, I was the higher level, but Fred was that older guy in my life that was wiser and just taught me so much. Fred, thank you. Thank you. But I remember that day, Fred went and got this guy named Sergeant, I don't know if he was a sergeant at the time, but he was Fire Medic Philip Martinez. So he went and got Martinez, who was the fire medic, and said, hey, I have this guy that needs to schedule ride-alongs. So Sergeant Philip Martinez ended up talking to me, but I remember we talked for about an hour that night. And I told him what I wanted to do and how I wanted to be a doctor, but hey, right now I'm in EMT school. He said, okay, here's what you need to do. I want you to call downtown. You're going to talk to a captain named Marie Harrell. Let's see if we can get you scheduled. So sure enough, I got it approved. They gave me permission to be able to ride at that very station. But she gave me a few different stations to choose from that were the busiest stations where I'd have the best experience. My very first ride along, I go back to Station 6, that same station where I had met Fred Mosley and then Philip Martinez, and I meet a gentleman named Mr. Bobby Funderburk. He was my very first EMS preceptor, and I remember he started calling me Doc, but Bobby would end up just teaching me, and I rode with him several times. Bobby would just involve me in the process. He always gave me something to do. He kept me learning. If I would ask him a question and he didn't know, he's like, hey, that's a good question, Doc. Let's find out. But do you know that this same guy would later hire me as an instructor? He would go on and start a company, start his own EMS education company. He would later hire me years later as one of his lead instructors. Bobby, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for all the opportunities that you've given me. One of the other medics that I rode with quite a bit, who was just a really funny guy. I really enjoyed the times that we spent together. He taught me what he could, but he really just modeled for me just what it was like to be calm and just composed. And his name was Fire Medic Rodney Bowles. Rodney, thank you for just encouraging me to follow my dreams. Thank you for guiding me. Thank you for just being that support for all the years that would come. Thank you for all you've done. So I would go on, and eventually I would become a paramedic. I'd end up working on the ambulance. Well, first I'd go on and become an EMT and start working on the ambulance. But while I was there were several people who just encouraged me to go further. One of the guys, his name was Steve Rush. He was a firefighter. Steve and I would become great friends. But Steve would say, he's like, Doc, you need to do more than this. He's like, you're not going to be happy just being an EMT. You need to go on to being a paramedic. He would say, he's like, Doc, you're over the top, man. He's like, your knowledge is definitely at a different level. You need to pursue more. Steve would become just a great friend and also another mentor. He and Fred were kind of like older brothers to me that would just teach me so much about life and be there for me so much over the years. So Steve, I appreciate you for all you've done. Thank you for just your mentorship and your guidance over the years. I appreciate you more than you know. Another gentleman I met while I was on the ambulance and had an opportunity to ride with him many times was a gentleman named Mr. Holman. Garen was just a really funny guy. I really enjoyed riding with him. Garen one of the biggest things he taught me, for some reason he never called me Crawford. He would say, Crawford. He said, one thing you need to know is as long as you know what to do next, there's no more emergency. I would say this to myself over and over the years. I would say, hey, as long as you know what to do next, there's no more emergency. Garen, thank you for teaching me that. The same thing that you've taught me, I have taught it to so many students over the years. Garen, I want you to know that I've worked really hard to try to always know what to do next. I would go on and further my education so that I would learn more and more, so that I'd be able to help as many patients as possible, so that I could truly give the care that the patients would need and deserve, and that would be most appropriate in their situation. So Garen, thank you for all that you taught me. Garen was one of those people, along with Steve and Fred, who encouraged me to continue on and go to paramedic school. Garen, I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Well, I did decide to go to paramedic school right away. I wasn't really happy as an EMT. I noticed that a lot of the paramedics I was riding with, some of them didn't seem to care. Some of them I feel like they gave up too quickly or didn't really do much at all for the patients. And so I knew I wanted to be the paramedic so that I could affect a lot of the decisions being made on the ambulance. The paramedic was the one that was riding in charge of the ambulance when you had a paramedic and an EMT. And I said, okay, I've got to be that paramedic. Well, the next thing meant I had to go to paramedic school. So I did. I ended up meeting a guy who would become one of my best teachers. His name was Mr. Chris Cagle. He was my paramedic instructor. We would spend quite a bit of time together, and week after week, he would just pour out his heart, and he would teach us so much. Mr. Cagle, I appreciate you for opening that door for me. I appreciate you for guiding me, for encouraging me to never stop learning, never stop pursuing my dreams. I remember the day you told me, you said, don't worry, I know you're going to medical school. I was still a paramedic student at the time, but I remember you saw something in me and you said, hey, don't worry. Mr. Cagle, I really appreciate you. One of the other people so I would go on and finish paramedic school, become a paramedic. I would graduate as the number one person in my class. Now, I was the third person to test, but I ended up as the first person to finish, and I was the number one student in my class. I remember I had been a paramedic about a year at this point. So this is around 2010 or so, or about 2011 at this point. I go on a call one particular day a call comes out. I'm at the station. I'm on one ambulance and the paramedic supervisor is on the other ambulance. A call comes out and I can hear all the commotion going on the radio. I don't know what the call is, but I know it's bad. I can hear in the firefighter's voice who are arriving on scene and getting information from dispatch that this call was a little unusual. Long story short, what happened was there were two guys they were cousins, I believe. They got in an argument over a woman, and one cousin ended up opening the door and the driver ended up shoving the passenger out of the car. He didn't just push him out of the car. He drove over him, backed up, and drove over him again. But the second time, he left the car on the guy. So now the patient is underneath the car. The firefighters arrive on scene, and I can hear the commotion. I'm like, okay, this sounds bad. So I tell my partner, I'm like, hey, Mark, I don't know what's going on, but we need to go. And the paramedic that got assigned the call, her name was Regina. She was the paramedic supervisor at the time. I said, hey, let's go help out Regina. If she doesn't need our help, we'll just stay in service and we'll just come back to the station. If she does need our help, I will jump in the back of the ambulance, I'll help her, and then I will go to the hospital with her and then ride back to the station with her. I end up, when I arrived on scene, they freed the car off the guy. They're loading the patient into the ambulance, and I say, "Hey, Regina, do you need a hand?" She says, "Yes." So I jump in the back of the ambulance with her. This particular day, it's crazy how this story happened. This particular day, they had a brand new firefighter who had just graduated rookie school. He's still in a necktie and the dress blues with the shiny shoes. He's that new. He was at the graduation ceremony and leaving the ceremony to go back to his station when the call came out. So he's not even in turnout gear like everybody else. He's in a necktie. So this rookie firefighter, like first day on the job, first medical call at least, he gets in the back and he's squeezing the bag to breathe for the patient, but his adrenaline is going, so he's squeezing the bag like, and so I'm watching everything that's going on, seeing how I can help, and as calmly as I could, I said, "Hey sir, what I want you to do is I want you to squeeze the bag about one breath about every 5 to 6 seconds. So we would go on and secure the patient's airway. We would go on and get IV started and continue with the rest of everything that we had to do. This was a very complicated case. Part of his face was burned off. He needed to be flown to the burn center and so forth. But I remember riding in with them, and after we left the hospital, Regina said to me, she said, "Doc, your gift is teaching." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" She says, "The way you were so calm on that call, the way, despite all the chaos, you were able to maintain your composure, but you still were teaching during the call." When she said that to me, I didn't exactly know how to take it. I heard it, but it didn't really register at the time. But year after year, Regina would encourage me. She'd say, "Doc, your gift is teaching." I'm going to come back to that. But Regina, I just appreciate you for believing in me. I thank you for seeing something in me, and thank you for encouraging me for all the years. Thank you for everything you've done. So I would go on, end up working I got hired at the medical center. The medical center, the trauma center, was going to be starting a program where they were going to hire paramedics for the first time, and they would hire 5 initially. I became one of the first 5 because of one lady, Miss Ashley Forsyth. Ashley was the director of the trauma center, or she was the ED director at the time, I believe. She gave me an opportunity. I was one of the 5 people that she hired initially. But while I was there, I learned so much, way more than I would have known. And Ashley, I just appreciate you for giving me that chance, for taking a chance with me, for giving me that exposure that would give me so much experience that I would need as I would continue along my journey. Well, while I was there, I worked there for some time, and then while I was there, one of my main charge nurses and the flow coordinator was a young lady by the name of Kimille. Kimille was a registered nurse, like I said, charge nurse, flow coordinator. She was my supervisor. Really tiny lady that was just like, she would walk so fast up and down the hallways. But I just remember Kimille, she was probably one of the best managers or supervisors I had ever had. She was so kind. She was stern. You knew that she meant business. But Kimille gave me so many opportunities. She provided so much support for me. She would just let me do what I needed to do. She trusted my judgment. And I learned so much as I got to work under her. Kimille, thank you for trusting me. Thank you for everything that you did. Thank you for all the opportunities that you would provide for me. I learned so much from you. Kimille would go on and become a nurse practitioner, but I'm just so grateful for that experience. I would go on and graduate college. I was in college and working at the hospital at the same time. One particular day while I'm in the emergency room, I end up running into one of my coworkers. She comes up to me. She was working day shift. I was working night shift. So she comes to me at shift change and she says, "Hey, Doc, I want to talk to you for a moment. I remember working in triage that particular day. And this paramedic came to me. She was a fire medic from the fire station. We worked together at the hospital as well. And she says, "Hey, there's an opportunity over at the college. They need a lead instructor. I think you'd be a great fit for this. I think this would be a great opportunity, and you're just the guy to take this. You have the education experience, you have the background. I think you'd be a great fit. Plus, you like to teach." Her name was Fire Medic Keila Stewart. "Keila, I really appreciate you for just opening that door for me. You didn't have to come to me. You didn't have to give me that opportunity, but you did. And I appreciate you so much for that." So in that conversation, Keila said, "Hey, here's what I need you to do. I want you to go in the morning. I want you to call over to the fire station. Call this number. You're going to ask for a lady named Captain Mary Simonton." So I did. She said, "Captain Simonton she's the program director over the EMS and fire division over at the college. I want you to talk to her. She may have an opportunity for you." So I did. I ended up calling the number, talking to Captain Simonton, and she gave me an opportunity. She hired me to be a lead instructor at the college. This would start my first real serious teaching assignment. Captain Simonton, thank you for that opportunity. Even though you and I didn't really know each other, you gave me an opportunity that nobody else had given me at that point, and that has opened so many doors for me. I appreciate it. Thank you so, so much. I would continue on and work as a paramedic on the ambulance. I would be teaching at the college. I was working in an emergency room. But I was starting to grow more and more frustrated because I felt like I had more to offer and I wanted to be able to do more. I certainly had a desire for more. I remember going on a call one particular day. I had a cardiac arrest patient. And I remember working on this gentleman he had been down in cardiac arrest for about 14 minutes when we got on scene. My partner and I was working with a guy named Eric Mejia that particular day. We worked on this gentleman, Mr. James, and his family has given me permission to use his name. We worked on Mr. James for literally over an hour. He was in cardiac arrest this entire time. Eventually, we actually got a pulse back. However, just a few minutes later, he lost his pulse again. But I remember transferring his care once we eventually, because we stayed there working on him in his bedroom floor for probably about 45 minutes or so. Eventually, we got to the hospital. At this point, we're almost an hour and a half into this episode because we're out in the county. We make it to the hospital. They get another heartbeat back. Eventually, he makes it to the ICU. A couple of hours later that night, I returned back to the hospital that same night after I got off. I got off late, but I returned after I got off, went to the hospital, and he had just arrived in ICU at that point. I remember talking to his wife, Miss James, and I just said, "Hey, if you don't mind, are you okay if I just go and just put my hands on him and just pray for him?" And I did. She said, "Sure, no problem. I would love that." So I remember going to the right side of the bed. I remember putting my hand on his shoulder, and I just started praying. I didn't know what the outcome would be. It wasn't looking good at this point, but I knew that I had done everything I could do for him. Well, I left. It was getting late. At this point, it's after midnight. Visitation hours are over, but they allowed me to go. Since I was the paramedic that brought him, they allowed me to go and see him. So I left the hospital, go home. A couple days later, I get a call from my regional vice president of the ambulance service. And he says, "Hey, Joshua, I just want to ask you a question." I said, "Okay, what's going on?" He said, "The other day you went on this call and you clocked out late, and that caused you to go in overtime." I said, "Okay, yes." He said, "Why did you go in overtime?" I said, "Well, the call came out late. We worked on this gentleman for quite some time." I told him the whole story. I said, "Hey, my partner, that shift, he was working on his next job the next day, so I told him to go ahead. I would write the report, I would restock the ambulance, and I would wash the ambulance." But I remember how it made me feel, because I remember saying to the regional vice president, oh, by the way, the patient is still in ICU. He still has a heartbeat. I don't know how he's going to make it, but Mr. James is alive today. But I remember they never asked me about the patient. They asked me, why did I go into overtime? And I just remember how that made me feel. I felt like the company I was working for didn't really care. They didn't care about me, and I didn't feel like they cared about the patient. So I said, okay, that was a lesson for me. And I said, okay, I got to do something different. So I ended up going to critical care school. I decided that I've got to do more. I would dream of being a flight paramedic. I said, I would see the guys in the flight suits, and I'm like, hey, if I could be one of them one day, maybe that would be cool. What if that was my story, if I could actually end up on a helicopter? And I remember year after year, I would just dream of what that would be like. However, it was just a dream. But year after year, I would imagine myself sitting there on a helicopter, being in a flight suit. So what I did is I applied. And over a year and a half, so 18 months, I ended up doing 15 applications. I ended up getting some interviews during that time, but I was so frustrated because interview after interview, I would just get rejected. One particular day, I ended up on this one interview in South Georgia. The program director at this particular base decided, for whatever reason, he didn't want to hire me. I thought it was a little strange because I tested well. I did well on the clinical exam. My score was well. I thought I probably did better than many of the other applicants, but I didn't get the job. I would later find out that one of the reasons I did not get the job was because of my skin complexion, that I was a person of color. And that was the obstacle. I just remember how that made me feel, but there again, I just refused to give up. Yes, one guy made the judgment, he made the mistake of looking at me for the color of my skin. I don't know why he did it. I just know that's what happened. However, what if I told you that things were still working behind the scenes? I didn't know how it was all going to work out. But one particular day, I got a call. Well, I actually got a text message. I had gotten a call from this gentleman, but then he sent me a text message, hey, your voicemail is full, so I couldn't leave a message. He said, my name is Jim Goodrow from Air Evac Life Team. He said, I'd like to talk to you about an interview. So I called him the next day. I remember it being about 10 o'clock at night. I could not wait to get off the next day so I could call this guy. So as soon as I got off, I remember on my drive home, I called the number, spoke to him, and said, okay, so what's going on? He said, all right, we have a position that just came open due to a tragic circumstance. I'd like to interview you. He said, I don't know what this is, but I remember him using the phrase, he said, the stars are aligning for you, young man. Excuse me, guys. He says, this is the craziest thing, but your application is still in the system from where you interviewed previously with the same company. So I interviewed for 3 companies, but I still had a pending application in their system for that company. He said, the thing is, your application will expire in 3 days. So 3 days from now, you'll have to start the entire process over again. So he said, here's what I need you to do. I need you to go to a base in Georgia. So he was calling me from a base in Alabama, like 3 hours away. He said that I need you to go to a base in Georgia that's going to be closer to you. There's a young lady I need you to meet. Her name is Rachel Sweeney. There's some computer work I need you to do, and there's a test I want you to do. And she's going to give you the paperwork to get the drug screen and do the background check. So anyway, Mr. Goodrow, little did I know, he and I didn't actually know each other. I knew that. But because he and I didn't know each other, he had to reach out to another gentleman, a gentleman by the name of Mike Vick. Mike was a registered nurse that I had worked with from time to time at the emergency room. But Mike and I didn't exactly know each other all that well. He just kind of knew me in passing as a paramedic who worked in the community, and then he saw me in the hospital. Would you know that Jim Goodrow called Mike Vick and said, "Hey, there's this guy over in Georgia. I think you know him, or I think you've worked with him." Mike said, "I'm not exactly familiar with him, but hold on just a minute. Our charge nurse may know him better." So he literally put Jim on hold, talked to the charge nurse named Sarah, and said, "Hey, Sarah, I have this guy on the line. His name is Jim Goodrow from Air Evac. He's asking about this guy named Joshua. Do you know him?" She's like, "Yeah, you know the guy. He's really thorough. He's the paramedic. Really nice guy. He's really smart. I think he'd be great." Did you know I had no idea any of this was going on behind the scenes? But Jim talked to Mike, who talked to Sarah, who gave me a good word. The next thing I know, Jim said, "I tell you what, let's move forward. I feel good about this. Let's go ahead with a formal interview." So he invited me to Birmingham, Alabama. I drove about 3 hours to go interview with him that day. And he hired me. Guys, I want to thank Mike for just speaking up for me. Mike, you didn't have to do that. But I appreciate you for just putting your neck out for me and opening a door for me that I didn't even open for myself. I thank you for just allowing God to use you that day. Mike, we've become great friends over the years. You've taught me so much. I never will forget the time when I called you one night. I was leaving Knoxville, Tennessee, driving about 5 hours to Georgia, and you and I talked for a few hours, and I remember you talking to me about your experience as a nurse and giving me tips on what it would be like to be a doctor and how to be a great doctor. Mike, thank you for just all the opportunities, and thank you for all the conversations over the years. But would you know that a dream came true? Before you knew it, I was actually going off to O'Fallon, Missouri, and ended up getting hired to be a flight paramedic with a company called Air Evac Life Team. While I was there, and so guys, I want to spend a few minutes here. This was such an important time in my life. I would spend so much time here. In fact, when I became a flight paramedic, it was probably the highlight of my career. I enjoyed that probably more than anything else I've done in life, with the exception of one other thing that I'll tell you about. But while I was there, I had an opportunity to work with just some amazing, amazing people. I remember the day that Mr. Goodrow, after my very first flight, Mr. Goodrow came to the base and pinned on my wings for me. We could not wear our wings on our name badge until we had completed our first flight. So after that flight, he was there waiting on me, and he pinned on my wings. And Mr. Goodrow, the stars did align. Jim, I want to tell you, thank you so much. Jim, you opened so many doors for me. One guy saw me based on my skin complexion, but you saw me for who I am. Jim, you opened the door that, yes, I would be the only person of color at that base. I would be the only person of color in the entire state as far as the med crew with that company. But Jim, you opened a door that has changed my life. Thank you for giving me a chance. I know I was the outsider from Georgia going to this base 3 hours away in Demopolis, Alabama. But Jim, thank you for just seeing me as a man. Thank you for seeing past whatever perceived limitations that other people saw. Thank you for giving me a chance. Thank you for believing in me. Jim, I owe you so much. I'm indebted to you forever. I will forever sing your praises for just the opportunities that you've given me. Jim Goodrow, thank you. Now, guys, I apologize for the length of the video, but I just want to make sure I'm acknowledging the people who really made a difference for me. While I was there at Air Evac 106, I had an opportunity to work with an amazing group of people. So we worked with flight nurses, flight paramedics, and pilots. We were a 3-person crew on the helicopter. Just had so much fun. So many challenging situations, but we had so much fun together. This was just an amazing group of people. You guys took me in like family, and I really appreciate just the time that I got to spend there. So I worked with some amazing flight paramedics. I worked with some pilots. So these are the pilots that I worked with the most. I worked with lots of pilots as I would do pickup shifts over at different bases, but these are the pilots I worked with the most. Jim Goodrow, who was also our program director, also worked with a gentleman named Mr. Gary Fisher. Our base pilot supervisor at the time, his name was Mr. Ty Calderwood. There was a guy named Mr. John Kidd, one of the Marine pilots. We had a Navy pilot named Scott Cochran. We literally had all the branches represented. Space Force had not been created, but we had all the other branches represented. There's this one particular guy named Rock and Run. He was our oldest pilot at the time. I think I remember celebrating his 70th birthday, but the guy was just excellent. All of our pilots were very skilled aviators. Now, I got to tell you, this is kind of funny. All the pilots were amazing. All of them were skilled. Now, some of them were a little shakier, or some of them were a little more aggressive. I remember this one particular day, Gary, let's go back to that picture. He's going to get me. I remember Gary, I was like, hey, Gary, you see those power lines? You're getting really close. He's like, I've got the power lines in sight, Mr. Crawford. There was another day I was flying with Jim, the same guy who hired me, and I remember this particular day, we had some critical patient. I had to intubate the patient. My partner and I were working together, trying to keep the patient alive, trying to do everything we could. And because Jim at this point was our boss, he was our program director, he was extremely methodical. Now, extremely safe. I loved flying with the guy. But this particular day, I'm in the back with my partner. We've got the patient loaded. And it probably took us about 10 minutes to lift off. I don't exactly know what he was doing out there. But I remember, so Jim, it wasn't me. It was my partner. She was like, what is he doing? I was fine with it. But anyway, we had the patient under control. We took care of the patient. Anyway, we fly off. Now, I will say, guys, it happened to be probably our slowest landing ever. But I remember looking out the window and I'm like, man, I probably could jump out and get down faster. We were landing on the roof of UAB Hospital, taking this critical patient. But I think we had to, there was something, maybe restricted airspace or something else was going on. That's the reason we had a prolonged landing. But I just remember just having an amazing experience. Now, all the pilots, like I said, were great. There was one particular one that was, I'm not saying that he was better than the other ones. He was just a little extra special to me. And that's Rock and Run. Now, as I mentioned, he happened to be the oldest pilot, but what was really cool about him is our birthdays are right together. So we actually shared our birthday together one particular year or a couple of years. But the real reason he was so special to me is sometimes if he was the night pilot, when, let's say, so he had to sleep during the daytime, I would be on for 24 hours, but the pilots were on for 12 hours. So there were some days where we would leave during the daytime, go on another flight, and I would come back. He had gone to the store, and he would go into my bedroom and put a bag of jelly beans, Starburst jelly beans, on my pillow for me. So that's why Rock and Roll was my favorite. He kept the jelly beans coming. In fact, just the week of Christmas, I had an opportunity to reconnect with him. That's Rock and Ron sitting next to me. We had not seen each other for several years, but we had an opportunity to reconnect, and it was just a really fun time. But so I worked with several nurses while I was there, but there was one particular nurse that was really special to me. and it was actually my partner. My partner, her name is Lindy. Lindy Stephens was the person that I spent the most time with. We had a lot of very difficult situations together, but the thing that I admired the most about Lindy was that she trusted me. She trusted my judgment. We didn't know each other. We had never seen each other before I got there. She didn't know anything about me, so nobody knew me. I was just this outsider that got hired in from Georgia. But Lindy and I, we kind of figured each other out, and then we had just a beautiful working relationship. We got into a lot of craziness together. We had a lot of difficult patients. Now, guys, and just so you know, one of the things I heard over the years is some of my flight nurse partners, they would say, "Hey Joshua, we don't want to fly with you because every single day you fly, we have some of the worst patients. We have the most critical patients. We have just craziness." They called me they used a different word, but I'll say poop magnet. I was like, "Hey guys, I just show up to work. I can't help the calls we get. We're here to save lives, and we're here to do the best we can." But we really had some really difficult patients. But I do want to tell you this one story. One particular day, Lindy and I were coming from a flight. I actually believe we had the patient loaded, but it was a long distance flight, like an hour-long flight. Well, it's in the winter, I'm freezing cold, and suddenly I have to go to the restroom. You can imagine this is a very small aircraft. This is a Bell 206 long-range aircraft, so it's really small. You're almost touching, your arms are basically touching each other. So I find myself in this situation where suddenly I have to go pee. There's no bathroom in the helicopter. We can't just pull over anywhere. So I'm like, "Hey Lindy, you and I are close, but we're not that close." So imagine me in a one-piece flight suit. I say, "Hey Lindy, here's what I need you to do. I need you to turn your head, look out that window. I've got a situation I'm about to handle over here, and you don't need to know any part of this." So I literally had to go pee in a urinal. Anyway, so can you imagine how awkward it is where literally somebody is next to you, your arms are touching, and I've got to pee in a urinal, and I'm like, "Hey, you just keep looking out the window." But you had to do what you had to do. But so Lindy, I enjoyed working with her. However, Lindy was always up to some shenanigans. So one particular day, I think she waited for this moment. I think she took delight in this. So here it is. I'm minding my own business. I'm not bothering anybody. Next thing I know, Lindy ends up catching me napping after a flight. But she didn't just catch me napping. No, this partner of mine decides she's going to post this on Facebook. But hey, that's not what made it so bad. She caught me that first time, right? But then she caught me another time. So this particular day, and like I said, I'm sitting there, I'm not actually asleep. I'm just thinking about how I'm going to save the next life. No, I'm actually really knocked out. So she catches me and the pilot. So I'm like, "Oh, okay, I see what Lindy's up to." So now, what was cool about her is one particular year, she was actually voted Flight Nurse of the Year. So think about that. You have the flight paramedic asleep. You have the pilot asleep. There are only 3 people who are working per the shift. So that means the flight nurse must be awake, standing at attention, ready for the next call, right? Oh no. Check out this lower right corner. Oh yeah, that's the Flight Nurse of the Year. That's my partner, Lindy, knocked out. But not just knocked out. She's got a blanket pulled up, drooling over the blanket. Now, I'm not going to take responsibility for this, but I'm going to blame it on the pilot, Scott, because that's just easy to do. But I couldn't wait for this opportunity to catch this picture. I know she's going to get me when she sees this. But we had a lot of fun together. We would work on we'd work on patients of all ages. So for instance, we had some really tiny patients. This is a 2-month-old one particular day that's in a respiratory failure. We had patients from literally 1 or 1 minute old to over, I think I had, our oldest patient was maybe like 104. But we had all types of situations. Sometimes we'd find ourselves in really extreme situations. One day we're in the back of a military helicopter. Another day we're in the back of an ambulance having to travel by ground because we're weathered in and can't fly. Sometimes we were in situations where we'd be in thunderstorms and we'd be stuck somewhere. Now, this one particular day, we're stuck at the airport. It happens to be the day of the Alabama-LSU game. We get trapped at the airport, can't leave, can't fly back to our base. We're just stuck there. It's storming. I mean, we're weathered in for hours. Well, since it happens to be the game and the medical director happens to have an RV, we figure out a way that we need to end up at the game so that we can tailgate. Next thing we know, we're sitting there in our flight suits, tailgating, just having an amazing time. But we also had to, we got to see some really cool views. So the picture on the left is a picture where we're flying along one day and we see the stadium. Another day, the picture in the lower right is a house on fire. As we're flying along, we see this house that's fully engulfed, smoke everywhere. Other days, we're seeing plenty of sunrises and sunsets. But then the day would come where it was time to leave. And so after commuting for 3 hours every single shift from my home in Georgia to this base in Alabama, eventually an opportunity came for me to transfer to another base. If you'll notice the picture, there's a shadow, the one that says from Alabama, there's a shadow of the helicopter. This is my last flight, that as we're coming back in to land on the helipad, the shadow happens to land directly on top of the building, so I happened to catch that view. But this is my last day. So I would go on to a Georgia base, and I didn't get to have exactly the same type of experience there, mainly because I wasn't there as long. But one of our policies, and by the way, thank you so much to all of the friends that I made and coworkers and colleagues that I had at Air Evac, especially Air Evac 106. Thank you guys for treating me like family. Thank you to all the pilots, the flight nurses, the flight paramedics. Thank you, Jim Goodrill, for all that you've done for me. I appreciate you guys more than you know. Eventually, I ended up at the Georgia base, and like I said, I enjoyed it there as well. I just wasn't there as long because we had an interesting policy. This particular policy was that you had to meet the weight limit. And so we had to weigh in every single month. I lost my grandmother during this time, and it was just kind of a particularly stressful period. I started cycling around that same time. I ended up doing the bike ride across Georgia. I cycled for 400 miles in 1 week, and then in that month I did 1,000 miles on my bike. But imagine if you have to cycle that much, you have to also eat a lot. So, and I was always kind of at the top end of the weight limit, but I would sometimes starve myself for a few days to meet the weight limit at the weigh-in. This particular day, it's time for my weigh-in, and the program director says, "Hey, you're over the weight limit." I'm like, sorry, too many cinnamon rolls. So I end up not meeting the weight limit, so I get written up. That was the policy. So he said, "Okay, no problem. Just next month, just make sure you meet the weight limit. Everything will be fine." The next month, I had lost some weight, but I was still over. So, no, the first time, I don't think I got written up. I think it was second time is when I got the write-up. I was over the weight limit, guys. He says, "Hey, no problem. You get one more weigh-in, so your third weigh-in. As long as you meet that one, you're good." Well, the third weigh-in came, and I had weighed myself. I was trying to diet. I had lost more weight, but I was a few pounds over the limit. And he told me, he said, "When I come in this evening, if you don't meet the weight limit, I'll have to terminate you." Now, he said, "But you have the option of just quitting. And since all your performance evaluations have been great, you'll be eligible for rehire more than likely because you haven't actually done anything. It's just we have a weight policy and you're over the weight limit." So I talked to my coworkers and they said, it's probably better for you to quit. So I thought about it, and I remember thinking, I have a family to take care of. So I called to the Department of Labor. I called the unemployment office. I spoke to a lady. I told her what the circumstances were, and she said, wait a minute, you mean to tell me they would terminate you for going over the weight limit? I said, yeah, I'm on a helicopter. That's the policy. We have a monthly weigh-in. She's like, son, I think you have a good chance. So I decided to just ride the clock out, because I knew that if I quit, I'd have no money, but I had a family to take care of. So I decided to stay there. The day came that it was my last flight. I knew I was over the weight limit, but I went on that flight, yet I knew that that would be my last flight. So we took a patient and we're flying from Alabama back to Georgia. This would be my very last flight that I would take. This would be my last time having a view out the helicopter window. But there again, I knew I had to take care of a family. I had kids that were getting older, and I knew I needed some income. But would you know that around the same time, I had already applied to medical school? There would be a rainbow at the end of all of this. In fact, in order for me to apply to medical school, I need letters of recommendation. So I had several people who ended up writing letters of recommendation for me. Dr. Cindy Parker, Dr. Darius Brown, Dr. Keith Blanks, Dr. Kenan McLendon, and then my biology professor, Dr. Monica Frazier. The other ones are all emergency physicians, and all of them wrote letters of recommendation, in addition to one from Mr. Jim Goodrow from Air Evac. But because of that, the next thing I knew is I had gotten provisionally accepted. Would you know that the same week that I got terminated is when I got the email, congratulations, Mr. Crawford, you've been, and it said that I had been provisionally accepted into medical school. The reason was I had been out of school for several years since I had gotten my degree, and they wanted to make sure that I did not just jump into medical school, that I went through their transition program to make sure that I was ready for the demands of medical school and that type of academic rigor. So I got accepted, but now where am I going to stay? This program is in South Florida. Would you know that so now I'm going to start within 2 weeks. I have less than 14 days. I'm about 12 or 13 days away from needing to be near Miami for this program. I'm calling around, scrambling, trying to find housing. I end up on the phone with this lady named Dr. Heather Brathwaite. She's a psychiatric nurse practitioner with a PhD. And Dr. Brathwaite, we had one phone conversation. Now, she didn't know me. We had never talked to each other. We had never seen each other. But she agreed for me to move into her home and stay for several months. I'm a total stranger at this point, but we had the conversation. I guess she felt good about the conversation. Dr. Brathwaite ended up taking me into her home in South Florida, and I stayed there for months. She was like that aunt that you know she loves you, but she takes no slack. She won't let you take it easy. She would come to me and say, Joshua, you doing your homework? I'm like, yes, Dr. Heather, I'm doing my homework. Dr. Heather, I appreciate you so much. You've become such an amazing friend. I thank you for just showing me so much love, so much support, so much grace, so much kindness. You created an opportunity for me to be able to go to Africa with you. We got to go to Africa together last year and join an amazing group of people, spend a few weeks in Africa. And thank you so much for all the opportunities, and thank you for just your continued friendship. Well, so guys, guess what? The day came where I had passed all of my exams, and I was now going to medical school. This was a dream come true. I finally got accepted into medical school. So I suddenly had to rush and get ready to transition into medical school. But I would meet a lady, as soon as I got accepted, I'd meet a lady named Miss Jessalyn that would be a part of our student affairs. She was one of our advisors, and she was the person that kind of took me under her wing, and she created so many opportunities for me. She showed me so much love, so much support. Jessalyn opened so many doors for me. Medical school is very difficult, but Jessalyn made that transition easier for me. She got me involved in student government, and I became an ambassador for the school and so many other things, serving on the Welcome Committee. Jessalyn, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for all that you've done for me. Well, one of the things that she did for me is that an opportunity came for the board of directors to come and check out the student housing. So at this point, I'm in Barbados. I spent a year there. And Jessalyn says, hey, one of the guys who's on our board is a former United States Surgeon General. I'd like him to come to your home. So sure enough, Dr. Cremona came to my home, and here's the 17th United States Surgeon General under President Bush. He ends up at my house in Barbados. Had an amazing experience there, but that's all because Jessalyn provided so many opportunities. Well, my first semester in medical school, I'm really struggling. Now I'm like, okay, this is way more intense than I would have imagined. The classes are just coming like clockwork. Every day I'm getting 4, 5, 6 more lectures. And I ran into a gentleman named Dr. Hood, Dr. Ricardo Hood, who served as one of my mentors. And Dr. Hood would just teach me how to study. He would tell me that I needed to be a part of a group, and I needed to form a study group. And Dr. Hood would become a mentor that would teach me so much. I would meet another gentleman named Dr. Kinney, who was a surgeon and emergency physician who had been a surgeon for about 40 years, a doctor for about 40 years. Dr. Kinney took me under his wing. He's a Indian doctor, but he was like my Indian dad, or almost like my Indian granddad. But Dr. Kinney taught me so much about how to take a very thorough history and do a very comprehensive physical exam. Dr. Kinney would literally put his hands on my hands and teach me how to palpate. He would teach me how to use my hands to make diagnoses that I wouldn't need imaging for. Dr. Hood and Dr. Kinney, you both taught me so much. Well, there were 2 other educators that I had. They were probably some of the best educators that I've ever had in life. I've had hundreds of professors at this point, but there were 2 in particular that stood out. One was named Dr. Laura Welke. She was my neurophysiology professor. And Dr. Ray King. Now, Dr. King he is a colorectal surgeon. He was also a PhD anatomist. I only had him twice ever in medical school, but he made such an impact on me in just those 2 days. Both of them, Dr. Welke and Dr. King, they had such enthusiasm. They made learning so much fun. Dr. Welke, when she was teaching me all about neuro, she was just so animated and so enthusiastic, and she would draw these neural pathways, and she's like, okay, we're going to start here, and we're going to go do-do-do, and then boom, and that's how she taught. And it's so interesting that a lot of the way that I teach is because of how Dr. Welke and Dr. King taught. Dr. Welke, Dr. King, I appreciate you both. Thank you so much. So I ended up in Florida at this point. I'm now a 3rd-year medical student at that point, and COVID hits. So we have a shortage of PPE kind of nationwide, and so I find myself in this kind of limbo period, this transition period where I need a job. The vaccines start coming out, and we have an opportunity to go and serve as a part of a COVID team. I'm looking for a job, and this opportunity comes up to work with the state of Florida. I'm in Florida at the time, and work with the city of Orlando and the state of Florida on a COVID project. Well, I happened to show up this one day. I got hired to be a canvasser, going door to door, knocking on doors, trying to get people vaccinated. At that point, I just needed a job. So I saw in the email that you needed to show up. Literally, this was the night before. I got hired the Sunday, the night before, like 10 p.m. The next morning, I need to show up at the Doubletree Hotel. I run into this gentleman named Mr. Ben, who was our incident commander. I just walked up to him and said, "Hey, sir, my name is Joshua Crawford. I'm a flight paramedic. Do you need a leader?" And Miss Terry was his deputy incident commander. So Terry is my sister from Kenya. The two of them looked at me, and I said, "Do you need a leader?" He pointed his finger and said, "Yes," just like that. Seconds after I met him, he said, "Yes." He said, "I tell you what, you're not going to be a canvasser now. I'm going to make you a strike team leader. Immediately, you'll be a strike team leader. You'll supervise about 8 people starting right now." So we went on that day. I became the strike team leader for a day. Later, at the end of the day, he met with me. I had to wait a couple hours. This first day was just chaos. We had 300 people, some iPads, and no structure, no direction. We just had people and iPads. So I waited for a couple of hours, and I said, "Hey, Ben," he asked me, "How did the day go?" I said, "Well, it was challenging, but we did the best we could with what we had, and we made it work." He said, "How would you like to be the branch director?" And I said, "Sure, sounds good." So this gentleman who I didn't know, this was my very first day meeting him. In a matter of less than 12 hours, I went from being a canvasser to a strike team leader to a branch director. I would go on to remain as the branch director for the rest of this project. I would be a part just of an amazing team of about 300 people who were going out making a difference in the height of COVID, just trying to do the best we could to try to get more people vaccinated. Well, fast forward, I finished that project. The project comes to an end, and now I'm still kind of in transition for school at that point because of COVID. So I had some time, and I finally had the money to pursue another dream. Remember way back when we were talking about Mr. Stantu? He was that guy when I was 14 years old that took me on a flight. Well, I said, I'd love to go to flight school. So I did. The next week, I decided to go to Flight School of Greenville in Greenville, South Carolina, and I enrolled in flight school. I would meet a gentleman named Mr. Ian Cowan, who was the very first instructor I had my very first day of flight school. So Ian is in the upper right corner. But then I would spend quite a bit of time with Ian, but I would also meet a gentleman named Mr. Mark White, who would continue to serve as my primary flight instructor. We'd spend a lot of time together. He would help me get to the point of soloing. Both Ian and Mark did, but Mark was my primary instructor at this point. I finished, I soloed, he got me across the finish line, and eventually I heard the words that I had always wanted to hear. "Congratulations, pilot." A dream had come true thanks to Ian, thanks to Mark. I appreciate you both for your support, your encouragement. I know it was tough. Flight school was one of the most difficult things I've ever experienced. But thank you so much. Mark, Ian, I owe you so much. Because of you, a dream came true for me. Well, one of the things that Mark did for me is he got me connected with a group of aviators, a group called Southeast Aviators, where it was a group of aviation enthusiasts, mostly people of color who were predominantly pilots. I had never even seen so many African American pilots, for instance. But Mark opened that door for me. Well, one particular day while I'm in South Carolina, there's another gentleman from the group, another pilot, who is there doing some training. And the three of us, Mark, this other gentleman, and I, go out to eat. His name is Mr. Ken Paget. Ken became one of my best friends. He's a pilot, became a close friend. But Ken wasn't just a friend. Ken actually opened so many doors for me. Come to find out, not only was he a pilot, he was also a flight paramedic, and we had worked for the same company, just in different states. So we connected that day, and we are still friends to this day. Ken opened the doors for me to be able to go on and do some contract work. So I ended up going on, I left Florida, went to Chicago, ended up working with the state of Illinois on a COVID project. I ended up doing another project with the state of Illinois. But that is largely due to the fact that Ken opened the door for me. Had Ken not told me who to contact, told me what he was doing, told me what I needed to do next, I probably wouldn't have had those doors open, but those doors opening led to so much more for me. So Ken, thank you so much. Okay, guys, thank you for staying with me. So eventually I go back and now it's time to get serious with school. I need to go ahead and finish. And I'm studying for my board exams. Well, I'm having a little trouble because at this point I had taken some time off, but now it's time to get back and finish. But also going through medical school, you just get so much information thrown at you that it's really hard to process all of that. Most educators are not really good. I mean, I've had good educators, but I've had very few that were excellent. Well, I ran into a gentleman in Illinois. I found out about this program in Illinois at the time called the PASS program, and I met this gentleman who changed my life. Dr. Francis Ihejirika. He was a med-ped, so internal medicine pediatrics doctor from Nigeria, who I met in Illinois. He had this program to help people prepare for their board exams. Dr. Francis taught me things that I never even knew. He taught me how to recognize patterns, and he taught me how to think differently about medicine. He taught me not to just memorize a bunch of details, but go back to the basics of learning, like truly mastering the physiology and the biochemistry. He said, hey, I'm going to show you how to understand concepts and apply it to 1,000 different diseases. I don't want you just memorizing something you read out of some book somewhere. I want you to know this for yourself so that you're going to be able to figure out things that you've never even read about before. Dr. Francis, thank you so much. Dr. Francis, you've been a mentor to me. You've been like a dad to me. You've taught me so much. I've never had an educator quite like you. I hope that I've made you proud in what I'm doing now. Thank you for your blessings as you encourage me to go on and pursue my dreams and pursue becoming an educator myself or furthering my career as an educator. Now, Dr. Francis, his mentor was a gentleman named Dr. Shaw. Dr. Shaw was a pediatric cardiologist who mentored Dr. Francis and taught him the same things that Dr. Francis would go on and teach me. So Dr. Francis, Dr. Shaw, I thank both of you for paving the way for me. So fast forward, I'm finishing this last contract in Chicago at the time, and one particular day I'm off, sitting in my hotel room, I decided to watch a sermon on YouTube. It was this gentleman named Pastor Mike Todd from this church in, I think it was named Transformation Church. He was doing this sermon about operating in your gift. And he says, the sermon I think was called Money Follows Mastery. So he starts naming things that people do. And he's like, if you braid hair, braid hair. If you cook food, cook food. If you write, write. If you sing, sing. And he goes through a whole list. Well, none of those really applied to me. I literally paused the video and I said, God, I need to hear from you. Make this man say that if you teach, then teach. Then I'll know you're talking to me. Guys, would you know that I pressed play and the very next words out of his mouth was, and if you teach, then teach. I remember jumping up. I screamed because I had never had a prayer be answered so fast. I actually was hoping the prayer did not get answered. But there I was. And I decided to go ahead and start my own company. So I started a company called Level Up Medic, where now I teach medicine. But I needed some guidance. I needed some mentorship. And so one of my greatest business mentors was a gentleman named Dr. Myron Golden. So that's Dr. Golden in the middle. And that's my son and I with him at a conference last year. But Dr. Golden has taught me so much about entrepreneurship, about operating business from a biblical perspective. Dr. Golden, Dr. Myron, I appreciate you so much. Thank you for all that you've taught me, and thank you for the difference you've made. So guys, if you've stayed with me to the end, I know this video was a little longer than I expected, but I just wanted to show you all the people that God used in my life. So I went from being a kid myself to having kids, having a whole family, to advancing in my professional career, especially in medicine and aviation. But none of it would have been possible had it not been for you. So from the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you to all the people who made a difference in my life, all the people that God would use, that you answered the call. Thank you for opening doors for me. Without you, my story wouldn't even be possible. To my heroes, I say thank you.